The recent terrorist attack in the Moscow subway system highlighted the threats that are posed to urban rail systems by terrorism, but it also highlighted the way in which large urban areas have their own particular set of vulnerabilities in the face of terrorist attacks. Tom Betro and John Gill are two senior advisors for 4D who have long histories working for law enforcement. Tom was the director of NCIS and John was the director of security for the White House, and they recently held a conversation about how to address these issues.
John, as you and I both know very well, there's been lots and lots of discussion over the past several years regarding challenges involved with securing places like railway stations and airports, and rightfully so. But today we're hearing a lot of discussion about protecting another type of environment, and that's the urban environment. As daunting the challenge was to protect airports and railways, and it still is, I can't think of an environment that's more complex and more difficult and more challenging to protect than the urban environment. I mean, there are no checkpoints, there's no borders, there's not screening people coming and going from the city. The people are free to roam pretty much anywhere they want to go in that environment. You know, what comes to mind when you think about the challenges of securing or protecting an urban environment?
You know, I agree that it is a tremendous challenge, Tom. And I think what comes to my mind immediately is communications and interoperability, the ability for public and private officials to be able to communicate on interoperable systems in a common operating picture. I think what we're finding in a lot of the major metropolitan areas is that they've developed some sophisticated technologies. They have put into place sophisticated communication systems, for example. They put into place sophisticated camera systems. But then they are continuing to build additional systems on that, and those additional systems have their own proprietary networks. Many of the cities are now putting into place systems that will respond to chemical, biological, and radiological threats, for example. A lot of cities are putting into place systems that will respond to cyber threats, but each are built on their own proprietary network, and there isn't an ability for these systems to communicate with each other across the network and also across the public and private lines either. So I think that's one of our major challenges that we're seeing in urban environments now.
Well, I think communication and collaboration have always been kind of keys to our ability as a nation to, in the case of terrorism, to be able to prevent terrorism. And you and I can relate. While we had lots of organizations in the government who thought we were communicating, we learned that there's another whole level of communication, and that technology really wasn't the obstacle to prevent us from doing that kind of communication. And I think, as you're describing here, in the urban environment, people might assume that since it's a smaller environment than the nation, that this is going on today. I mean, I don't know if you wanted to comment on the fact that while people may think that's happening, how do you see it?
Well, I think that there's an assumption that the entire network, the entire responsibility for putting into place a plan that provides for the security of a city in an urban environment is the responsibility of the public safety officials. And while that may be true in terms of having the primary responsibility, really it's a shared responsibility, because the critical infrastructures that are the key assets that may be targeted by criminals and terrorists are really owned mostly by the private sector. These are the transportation grids, the electrical grids, the chemical, and the oil and natural gas, the financial industries, all owned by the private sector. So it's absolutely critical that the public and the private sectors have the ability to communicate, so that when there is a crisis, that they can respond effectively.
So, John, I hear you mentioned quite a few times common operating picture, a term that I think people a lot of times will look at and think describes the intelligence component. I do agree completely that intelligence is a huge component of that common operating picture. In most cases, people want to know what each other know, about potential threats and responses. But I think there's a piece that's, in this case, in the urban environment, that's unique. As part of that common operating picture, has to do with knowledge of what all the other components of the urban ecosystem are responsible for doing, both in advance of a potential disaster, but also, more importantly, in response to that disaster, because the common operating picture allows them to synchronize those actions in a way that are much more efficient and hopefully will lead to better public safety and saving people's lives.
I agree, and I think it's all about leveraging technology to allow for police to utilize their resources more effectively. And that really involves the following things. As you mentioned, intelligence. Intelligence is a critical piece. The ability to have access to actionable, real-time intelligence is a critical piece of the overall plan. You also need to have a process in place that will analyze that intelligence and convert it into actionable information so that you can deploy that information out to your operators in the field. And lastly, the common operating picture that we keep talking about. You need to have the ability to share information on a common system throughout the public and private sector so that the public and private sector can respond to incidents effectively, whether they're natural disasters, whether they're terrorist attacks. Any type of crisis requires the ability to share information effectively, and the ability to put a common operating picture into place would accomplish that goal.